Hello, natural resource students. Today what we're going to be doing is reviewing to make sure that you have all the importance factors on the notes. A lot of times students will look at the notes and just find definitions. What we're going to try to do is identify specifically side points that I want to make sure to identify to help give a better understanding reptiles. So on Monday we started with reptiles and the definition and saying that they are scaly organisms that have the ability to live not just in water or reliant on water like our amphibians. These are going to be organisms that can have a dry, scaly skin because they don't have that whole ability to do diffusion, which takes us right into the skin. The skin is made up of scales. These scales are protective, kind of like what our fish are. They have different layers to them, and they're made up of a protein called keratin. Keratin is the same thing that makes up your fingernails and toenails, and claws. It's a strong protein that aids in keeping the reptile protected. These scales wear out, and so just like your skin has an outer layer to it that sloughs off, and you might have heard of the epidermis, maybe in lotion advertisements. The epidermis of the scales of the reptiles will molt off, and at this time the snakes and the lizards will molt all of their scales off and have a layer underneath it. What they're removing is just the dead outer layer. Their bodies will continue to grow, but the dead outer layer of their scales does not. So each time they get larger, they actually are just basically taking off a sweater or taking off more like a knight's armor suit. This takes us into the whole idea of reptiles and amphibians were the same way, and fishies are the same way. They are all ectotherms, which means they have to get their heat from an exterior source. This exterior source occurs because they don't have the efficiency to keep their bodies warm. They don't do aerobic respiration like we do. Our mitochondria break apart glucose and release this heat. They don't do that as efficiently, so their mitochondria are a little different in how they do cellular respiration. Plus, these ectotherms don't have the fat layers that we have. We have fat that helps insulate us, and that's what gives us our endotherm ability, basically our way we harvest our energy once we get it inside of us, and also our layers of fat along the outside. That takes you into the next part, and what I have there is the digestive tracts. Your reptile's digestive tracts will be short when they are carnivores. Not all reptiles are carnivores. A lot of our turtles will be herbivores. Some of our turtles and lizards will be omnivores. If they are a herbivore, they're going to have long digestive tracts to help break down the plant material. It's a little harder to digest. If they are carnivores, they're going to have short digestive tracts because the meat is an easier thing to digest. So this was the same way as our tadpoles. Tadpoles had long digestive tracts, and then once they became frogs, they had the shorter digestive tracts. With our frogs, they had gills when they were younger and then turned to lungs. But the lungs didn't have a diaphragm development like the reptiles have. A diaphragm is a muscular structure at the bottom of a lung. It aids in pulling down and opening up the lungs to allow more air to come in, and then it also pushes up and releases air out. This is how you breathe, and if you ever watched your tummy and how your ribs open up and close, the ribs help with bringing in oxygen, and so does the diaphragm. Next, on the diaphragm, once we get the diaphragm to open up our lungs and get more oxygen in there, that oxygen moves from a high concentration in our lungs to a low concentration of oxygen in the capillaries that are surrounding our lungs. Capillaries are one cell thick blood vessels that then lead into veins and arteries. Veins carry deoxygenated blood back to the lungs, and arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the lungs to the rest of the body. Then once the oxygenated blood in the arteries find a muscle or a bone or scales that are growing, those parts use up all the oxygen that then gets diffused back in. The low concentration goes back into the blood goes into the veins. It goes back to the lungs to go through the diffusion process again, to where it sucks up in the lungs. The high concentration of oxygen is sucked up in the veins, and then those veins then turn, in the capillaries, and then the capillaries release all this high oxygen into the arteries, and then it goes back to the scale that's growing, that then sucks out the oxygen, and then the veins carry the blood back to the lungs to go through the same process of the capillaries sucking in more oxygen and turning it into an artery. This system's kind of complicated, and maybe on Monday we'll ask a question if you don't quite understand that. These then take us into the excretory system of the reptile. With our reptiles, they kind of explain to you guys why bird poop is white on the outside. So sometimes when you see bird defecation, it doesn't look like ours, and that there's this white filmy material. That white filmy material is called uric acid. Uric acid is formed from our kidneys. Our kidneys are going to filter blood just like they do in us. They do the same thing in our reptiles, same thing in our amphibians and our fish. They're filtering our blood and taking wastes out. In us, we urinate it out. However, in reptiles and amphibians, they don't have a urinary tract per se like us. Instead, the urine is mixed in through the cloaca to be released out as poop. The uric acid is going to have a high amount of nitrogen in it, so it's the excess nitrogen that gives it this whitey film. Reptiles will do internal fertilization, unlike our amphibians that did external fertilization. Our reptiles are going to do internal fertilization. They have a stronger set of bones that allows them to run, to jump, and a slight misnomer is that some reptiles don't have legs. Snakes actually have vestigial legs in their skeletal system. These vestigial legs do not protrude unless there's some sort of mutation out of the snakes, and then your snakes would have actual protruding limbs. But in all reality, snakes always do have legs. They're just very vestigial, or meaning they're not seen. In our turtles, which is another reptile, they have a really cool adaptation to that. They have a carapace, which is going to be this hard outer shell, and this plastron, which is the under part of the shell that protects our little turtle. The reptile eggs is an example of an oviparous type of reproduction, to where we have an internal fertilization inside the female. Male mounts the female, releases his sperm through the cloaca into the female, and the internal fertilization occurs. But our reptile eggs don't have to be laid in water like they were with our amphibians. They can actually be laid in dry land, and this is because they have a hard outer shell, or it doesn't have to be hard, it can be soft, but it's an outer shell that keeps the amniotic fluid inside and not just going to dry out like our amphibian eggs would. This then gives the reptiles the ability to not have to rely on water as much. However, as seen in the video in the daily work, habitat loss is something that we do worry about. Reptiles are not as weeny as amphibians because of their scales. However, they still are threatened when we take away habitat, because that takes away their food. It comes back to that whole "oh dear" activity that we did at the beginning of all of the wildlife. If you take away one cog of an ecosystem, then everything can be affected on throughout. And so our reptiles, because of our habitat loss through urban sprawl or because of agricultural production taking away wetlands or even just dry pasture lands, our reptiles are affected. I will be back on Monday to help go through these. Hopefully this gave you an outline to add a few things to your list and not just the generic definitions, so that they can help you on your reptile quiz, which will be next Wednesday.